All of the U.S. military branches saw uses for rockets tipped with nuclear warheads. But President Eisenhower was intrigued by another use for missiles.
Reconnaissance satellites, spies in the sky.
Nikita Khrushchev had rejected Eisenhower's open skies proposal to use airplanes for mutual reconnaissance. How hostile, Eisenhower worried, would the Soviet Union be to a satellite flying overhead?
The great question hanging over the inauguration of the space age was, is it legal to orbit satellites over the territory of other countries? Is outer space subject to the same airspace laws that airplanes have to obey? It's not legal to fly U-2 airplanes over the Soviet Union if the Soviet Union doesn't permit it. Their airspace is an extension of their national sovereignty, extending upward. Usque ad coelum, in the Latin phrase, even unto the heavens.
In 1955, a potential solution to the problem appeared. Physicist James Van Allen was helping spearhead an effort to launch a satellite to study the Earth as part of a worldwide science effort called the International Geophysical Year, or IGY. Eisenhower immediately seized on the opportunity.
One of the things that Eisenhower was interested in pursuing was making sure that the first satellites into orbit were not viewed as military satellites, not viewed as national security assets. So a scientific satellite was perfect for that.
Shortly after Eisenhower's pronouncement, the Soviets announced they would also launch a satellite. A competition was now underway, not only with the Soviet Union, but within the Pentagon. All three military services competed to launch America's first satellite. The most serious contenders seemed to be the Army's proposal, which once again lashed together the rockets of JPL and the German V-2 group. By now, von Braun and his team were Alabamans. After all their V-2s were fired off at White Sands, they were reassigned to Huntsville and were now under the command of General John Bruce Medeiros. During World War II, Medeiros came close to being a casualty of one of von Braun's V-2s. Now the former German adversary was working for him. Yet the stigma associated with the Nazi V-2 was likely one of the reasons why the Army's proposal to launch the first satellite was rejected in favor of the Navy's Vanguard project, a rocket designed strictly for scientific purposes.
One significant difference between Vanguard and us was they had no military hardware involved in it. It was all nice civilian type, which is one reason it didn't work as well. They didn't have the experience.
The first of 3 Earth satellites to be launched by the U.S. during the International Geophysical Year just starting is about ready for its adventure into outer space.
The Army was both shocked and furious with the selection of Vanguard and demanded a review of the decision.
This caused great consternation in Huntsville at the Redstone Arsenal, where General Bruce Medeiros and Dr. von Braun had the hardware on hand to launch a satellite next week if they were just given the go-ahead to do so, but they were told, no, you're absolutely forbidden to launch a satellite. The Vanguard program is going to be our contribution to the IGY.
The Army consoled itself with work on a new generation of the V-2, a rocket that became known as the Jupiter C. This missile, carrying a nuclear payload, was to have a range of 1,500 miles. To reach such distances, the missile's flight path required boosting the warhead out of the atmosphere at the height of its trajectory. Surviving re-entry while accurately hitting the intended target was a new technological challenge. And for a third time, the German and JPL teams found themselves working together. As with the bumper whack, JPL would provide the upper stage, a boost theoretically strong enough to send a satellite into orbit.
And we indeed did quite a number of, several tests with von Braun's people in lobbing a reentry test vehicle about 3,000 miles out into the Atlantic. We realized that all we had to do was add another stage and we could have put that into orbit. That the Russians were hard at it. We thought the Russians were well ahead of the Vanguard program, and if only we were given the go-ahead, we could do it.
There was a deep suspicion on the part of some people in the Eisenhower administration that von Braun and General Medeiros, the commander at Huntsville, were a bit out of control, and that they might simply go ahead and launch a satellite on their own.
To keep that from occurring, the White House ordered the Army to fill the final stage with sand instead of fuel when the rocket was first tested in September 1956. Still, the Army did not give up hope. Spare rockets were placed in controlled storage, ready to be rolled out at a moment's notice.
General Medeiros even risked a court-martial by putting some of his people to work, spending money on preparing a Jupiter-C in hopes that the word would come down sooner or later from Washington.
By now, the Army's proposal had the support of the physicist responsible for the science payload to be launched. James Van Allen's review of the Vanguard revealed serious development problems. To hedge his bets, he designed his payload to fit on either Vanguard or Jupiter. Bill Pickering at JPL played his cards differently. Though JPL was part of the Army proposal, he also chaired the science committee charged with satellite tracking. One way or another, JPL would be a player when a U.S. satellite went up. But for good measure, JPL engineers had on standby an unauthorized but pre-existing satellite casing, just in case.
Well, we knew we were bootlegging it, very definitely, but we had, being a research organization, we had carte blanche to do anything we wanted to do. We went ahead and built one and had it ready to go.
We bootlegged the whole job, another JPLer later confessed. We locked up the satellite in a cabinet so it wouldn't be found.
It's one of those dates when the world changed, and it's a date where people remember where they were. Certainly, I'm sure Bill Pickering always remembered where he was that night. He was at the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C., of all the coincidences. A New York Times reporter bustled into the room and said that the Soviets had just launched a satellite. There were cheers, there were congratulations, rounds of vodka, of course, as the Soviet success was toasted.
There's a lot of discussion about it, and eventually they end up on the roof of the Soviet embassy looking to see if they can see anything.
The NBC guy came, I think it was at 9 o'clock, and he said, "Listen now for the sound that will evermore separate the old from the new."